risking a life sentence to expose war crimes and lies. Coming up on Citizens Insight. Welcome to Citizens Insight, the Citizens Party's interview series on matters of national and international importance. Today's interview is as serious as it gets. In just a few weeks, our guest today will be tried effectively in secret in an Australian court, and if convicted, he faces a life sentence. What's more, he's choosing to go through it instead of cutting a deal, because it's the only way to put the system on trial for the crimes and cover-ups that he's exposed. Welcome to Citizens Insight, David McBride.
Thank you very much, Robbie.
So I've been looking forward to doing this for a long time. I think you and I spoke in April about doing an interview.
You've been harassing me, serial harasser.
And I shout out to my friend Jay for suggesting this in the first place, but we're finally here. It's now October. But I heard you're in Melbourne, and I know your trial starts in a few weeks, and I thought, I've got to get in now, get David on the show now. So thanks for coming. But I want to express something from my standpoint. I think as Australians, we're all responsible for what you're going through and what you're about to go through, right? Because our country is doing this to you. So I want you to tell your story in detail, right? So we're going to start just all the elements of what people need to know about why this Australian is about to faces a life sentence, right, for what you did. But we're going to cover a lot of ground in this interview. We're going to get into some political stuff at the end. I want to foreshadow that with this question: is it fair to say, from your experience that you're going to tell us about, that it's changed the way you look at the world, including the big geopolitical issues in the world around China and Russia?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I didn't come to it easily. I'm a lawyer, I've got a bit of a science background. I wouldn't change, I wouldn't flip-flop from ideas, but I've pretty much had about 10 years to read a lot of stuff. I'm a reader. I've read a lot of stuff online, and critically, as a lawyer might. My views about what is going on geopolitically have changed. It's not necessarily that there are bad countries and good. There are a lot of bad people. It's like the car has been carjacked, is the way I describe it, rather, because it's hard to shake people's views about, to try to say that the US is a bad place or that China's not as bad as we think it is. People have very, definite views. But if you can say bad people have got control of the wheel and are using this vehicle improperly for their own purposes, maybe people can understand that. It's not so much people who've got self-interest and who really should not be controlling things. I think I read that once, definition of John Shipton said it to me actually, a book that Ralph Nader had written back in the 70s, and it was a definition of a whistleblower was someone who spoke up for the public good rather than the organisational interest. Something quite simple like that. And it's the first time I'd seen that, because at the end of the day it does come back, and this was what I was quite surprised about, to say you might be a senior person in the government defence force, but you're meant to be working for Australia, you're meant to be working for the common good. And that may vary in some ways, but it's pretty clear when you've crossed that line and you're not actually working for the common good. I imagine that goes to the heart of what you believe, but we have got people in public civic positions who are not working for the good of, and they would probably laugh if you said, you understand that you're meant to be working for the common good rather than yourself. I was quite surprised by that. A few things surprised me. Not only geopolitically, one thing that surprised me, and we'll get into why, and you're probably a bit more cynical, is a lot of people that look like us and talk like us are not like us. That surprised me. I thought I went to Christian school. My parents were both doctors. I probably had a very sheltered upbringing, but I thought most people in the world were good people. Maybe they'd have a bad day. I've gone back to, apparently it's one of the ancient Greek oracle points, apart from know thyself and to that own self. One of them is most men are bad. And I would have rejected that not so long ago, but I've come into the conclusion that is probably right.
Well, I'm not that cynical about that. I prefer to think people are good, but the system in which we exist means that in terms of the effect most people end up having, especially our political class, and my experience with the two major parties, it's like the law of the jungle out there, you know, and I don't see much of an actual commitment. I see slivers, David, of a personal commitment to the public good, but it's weak and it gets drowned out by the party machines and the system and the way they have to respond to the media, etc. And you know, so I think I get that. But anyway, let's start telling your story, right? Because it's a great story. Let's start from the beginning. You were a lawyer in the Australian Army.
Yep.
And you achieved the rank of major.
Yep.
That before you made yourself really famous. But before we talk about that, tell us about your life. How did you get to that point?
My father was a whistleblower. He was a guy called Dr. William McBride, who is credited with discovering the fact that this relatively harmless morning sickness drug, it actually, if taken during certain weeks in pregnancy, caused the baby to be born without arms or legs or something serious, and often die. And
you're talking about thalidomide?
Thalidomide, sorry, yeah, of course, thalidomide. And I didn't, so he was quite well known. He got some awards overseas, and my mother was a doctor as well. So, I was kind of proud of him. And he sort of had an interesting career after that. But I guess what's interesting about that was that we were relatively wealthy. I don't come from, and I always make this point, I don't come from a sort of disadvantaged background at all. I went to good schools. I ended up going to Oxford University. I did a law degree, a couple of law degrees. I didn't really feel like, I'd always wanted to be a soldier as a kid, and that got drummed out of me at school.
Right.
I was a true believer in, I grew up on the sort of adventure movies, Guns of Navarone and things like that.
Yeah.
That's what I probably took it a bit more seriously than other kids. That's what I wanted to do when I grew up. I wanted to sort of fight for my country, at the time, by the time I got finished school in 1981, there wasn't, there was post-Vietnam era. The Australian Army wasn't a particularly attractive prospect, but when I was finishing Oxford University, I met some British soldiers, officers, and I thought, this is what I want to do. They were on the Berlin Wall, they were manning tanks in Germany, all that kind of stuff which I'd admired from as a kid. They were doing Northern Ireland, where I'd seen the SAS, British SAS, abseiling through the windows of the embassy, and I thought this is what I wanted. I wanted to use my brain and planning ability and athletic ability to actually really help people. And so I joined the British Army, and my father wasn't particularly happy about it. He had the very old school, I guess. He'd grown up on the idea that the British officers drank tea while the Anzacs slaughtered in their thousands.
Did the heavy with
and so he wasn't particularly happy. But he came around. He came to visit me a couple of times, and I really enjoyed my time in the British Army. I did a tour of Northern Ireland. I went to Sandhurst, and I not only was it good fun, but you learn about leadership, and I learned a lot. Even though I'd come from good schools and things. I didn't know that much about leadership, and I learnt from those British people about what it really meant, and what it really meant. Well, it won't be surprised to you and your viewers, but the idea it's about putting yourself last. Officers eat last is one of their sayings, and looking after the troops under your command. Serve to lead is the motto of Sandhurst, and they lived it. They lived it, and I left the British Army in the mid-90s. I ended up doing security work in Africa, and was I did.
When you say security work, you mean military
Military work, yeah, diamond mines, that kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
The sort of job that ex-soldiers get.
Yeah.
And then I did security work for sort of a documentary series. We travelled around the world. Went to Afghanistan when the Taliban were in power. We went to a lot of other rogue nations like Iran, Sudan, Siberia, Eastern Siberia, and it was pretty. As Pakistan, pretty good. It was pretty good to see, some of the places which we hear a lot about, but it was quite nice to see the reality. So I enjoyed.
Any of those experiences surprise you? Did they really blow away your assumptions about what these places?
Iran was very interesting. It wasn't what I expected, and I enjoyed it. I'd like to go back, although at the moment it's pretty tragic what's going on there today. But Afghanistan was. I'd always wanted to go. That was one of the reasons why I took the job. But as soon as he said the magic words, Afghanistan, we want you to go to Afghanistan, I was like, yeah, I'll go.
Let's talk about Afghanistan, because this is where you made your name later on.
Yeah.
But you got to go to Afghanistan pre-9/11. I want the audience to be clear on that. This is your trip there. You've just been describing was pre-9/11. Was December 2000, something like that.
December 2000.
So this is before most Westerners were paying any attention to what was going on in Afghanistan, and of course before the war and everything that came afterwards. And it's ruled by the Taliban, right? How awful was it? And if that's a misleading question, contradict me.
Well, it was pretty bad. It's a leading question, as they say. We had stuffed it. The West had stuffed Afghanistan, and a bit like what happened in Ukraine. And I'll go right back to the beginnings of and this is all stuff that we met. First-hand experience of people that we spoke to in Afghanistan. So it's not someone's theory. But I have a typical legal disclaimer. You get people that get very upset, especially often Australians who have some sort of Afghan heritage,
right,
who want to tell you, have never been there, or who left when they were 2 or something, and want to tell you about it. And it's like, well, and I respect the fact that you might have Afghan heritage, but unless you've actually lived there, and these are people that I've met in the country that have told me this. Anyway, not everybody, and it was an interesting thing that you just start to see the difference between our propaganda and the truth.
Yeah.
Of course, I grew up in the 80s, and we boycotted. We were horrified. I think it was Christmas Eve 1979. The Russians invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And it was one of the big events that dominated the 80s. And Reagan and Thatcher but having since read very reputable books written by Americans about what actually happened, it wasn't the Russians. It wasn't nearly as demonic as we made out. I mean, there was already a communist regime there, and I've met people who actually quite liked it and said the problem with it, we were very backward. It was all run in a tribal way. People were starting, and I liked. People will say to me, I liked the communists. The communists set up farms. The communists did this, and not everybody felt that, but it wasn't some sort of like in a concentration camp or something. Some people didn't mind the communists.
And also, you can see photos from, considering what's going on in Iran right now, where the women are protesting having to wear the hijab. You can see photos of Afghanistan in that era, under the communist rule, where the women of Afghanistan walking down the street look like women in Paris.
Yeah, that's right. They didn't. That's right. A lot of women said that they did because communists didn't care about things like that.
Yeah.
And so, but because the Americans being the Americans and the Russians being, and this hypocrisy is shown out now, and that we still hate Russia even though they're not communists. So go figure.
So nothing Rambo 3 and the James Bond movie called The Living Daylights. In both of those, the heroes were the mujahideen.
Yeah, I'll have to go and re-look at that Living Daylights. I can't remember that. I do remember Rambo 3. A friend of mine sent it to me. It's quite funny. The heroic mujahideen, and the Russians said, "You understand that these guys will be fighting you one day." And we were like, "Oh, as if we're the freedom people." And sure enough, they were absolutely right because. And as I said, it's called Ghost Wars. It's a very good book by Steve Collin, and it tracks all of it. The Americans just jumped on it because it was a chance to kill Russians. That's all they cared. They didn't care about Afghanistan. And this is one of the big problems. This is why there's a quite good justification to say we really. I don't believe 9/11 was really an inside job, but we did cause that. It was a chemical experiment which we made possible. There was so much money going in there from the Saudi Arabians, so much money from the Americans, and they were matching dollar for dollar. We gave out all these sort of blowpipe and javelin missiles and then stingers eventually, and we had to eventually try and buy them. They would give anybody arms who was going to kill Russians, and nobody. It was not policed well, and we created a terrible thing. And then as soon as the Russians left, we abandoned them, and that vacuum meant that the most terrible people were. Everyone was a warlord. People who we a few months beforehand were calling brave mujahideen. Turned out they were murdering pedophiles and the most odious people, and they all set up their own little fiefdoms, and you couldn't go from block to block without having to pay one of these guys money, and they had like their own dungeons and torture chambers. In fact, one of the things that we'd like to downplay, and then the whole place was wrecked and they all they had like say 10 of these different warlord groups, and they all went to Kabul to try to win. They all got up on the hills in Kabul, and apparently they were just firing these heavy weapons down into Kabul. Every major, building was destroyed. That wasn't the Taliban. That was that was the people we backed. That was the people we backed, and they destroyed Afghanistan. And and what really happened, and this is what people don't understand. Those kind of mini warlords, for want of a better expression, but they were pretty horrible people, would just go around and they'd rape people. They would just take 12-year-olds out of homes and the Taliban rose to power because Mullah Omar, who had been a brave mujahideen in that he had actually fought the Russians, just like the sort of people with lion eyes, but he heard of, and he devoted his life to religion. Teaching, like he was a Sunday school teacher sort of thing. And he heard about the latest in many, rape of, I think, twins, 12-year-old twins by the local warlord. And he got a group of people together, his buddies, whatever, and they went to the warlord's place. They were way outgunned. I think there was a small amount of them, 10 as opposed to 40 from the warlord, quite relatively small skirmish, but they had the fire of vengeance in their eyes, and they hung this warlord from the tank. Now that's kind of true, and we downplay that, and we tried to paint him as the bad guy, but here's a guy who was first motivated to go into action because he was anti. We try to say, oh, women and girls, and his first military action was actually was to avenge the rape of two females, 2 young girls, and so it wasn't nearly as clear cut. And then they swept the country, and again, it's an unpalatable truth, and this is one of the problems we have, and this is why I get into arguments with Afghans about it, or people who don't actually live in Afghanistan but sort of have heritage. But to say, whether we like it or not, they were a popular movement with a fair bit of support. Not 100% at all, but they had support. And they also, we hated that. We tried to say they're not the real government. We're a bit like Taiwan. For many years, they had this phony government that didn't even live in Afghanistan. They were the real government. But we drove around the country when the Taliban were there, and they did control the country, and they were a de facto government in the sense that they had a minister for health. We met him. He was a doctor. They were trying to feed people. They were most upset that they had famines in '98 and '99, and a lot of their children died. And that's not to say that they weren't religious extremists. They were, but they were a product of however many years of absolutely terrible civil war, which the West had sponsored. Saudi Arabia in the West. It was a ruin. The country was a ruin before they took over, and they were trying to put it back together.
So you're there about 10 years after the West or the Americans withdrew.
Yeah.
And you see an Afghanistan where the Taliban, for all its faults, has brought order to the chaos.
Yeah.
And so you see a more functional society. And you also see that you got a story that I'd like you to tell about your experience where you're a Christian in this most oppressive of Muslim societies, supposedly, yet you were accepted. I mean, you weren't, you got away with being a Christian there, travelling around the place.
Our propaganda was, and this is one of the reasons was, they're chopping the heads off Christians, and they want to have world revolution and blah blah blah. And my experience was that wasn't true. I was not just the security, it was loosely termed. I was like the fixer. I wasn't on the screen, but I would go and meet with the representatives of the government, and I was a soldier, so I can understand that some of my opinions would offend people, but I'd been in Rwanda during the massacres. I'd met the Soviets, and so I'm used to dealing with people from the other side without getting too personal about it. But they didn't care that we were Christians. They knew we were Christians. They didn't have a problem with Christianity. You couldn't be a missionary and convert Muslims, but they didn't. Our propaganda tried to paint them as much more, crazy than they were. One night we were in our. It was certainly very an ugly place. There were no women on the streets or anywhere, and it was dirty. But that wasn't because of the Taliban. That was because of the 20 years of war that had gone on beforehand.
Yeah.
In the same way that London was probably a pretty ugly place in 1945.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we were sleeping in this very basic kind of hotel, and the door gets kicked open. It still makes me laugh now at 2 in the morning. And these guys, I don't know if you know, that they have makeup. They have makeup on. This sort of.
Oh, really?
Well, it's. They wouldn't call it makeup. They'd be offended, but they have this black eyeline under their eyes.
I've seen those.
And they have black turbans on. They look quite forbidding. It's quite unusual. They always look like it. It's not sure whether they're an 80s rock star or. and they come in with their AKs. They don't go with their AK, and they're like, they got their beards, and they're like, yeah, get up. Well, we didn't understand, but they're obviously saying, get out and pray. In the do your morning, mid-morning prayers. And then they saw us in bed, with our white skin, and we had to grow beards to travel around, but they were crappy beards, 6-week beards sort of thing. And they just started laughing. And they said, oh, no, it's all right, sorry. You don't have to go and pray, you're a Christian. And so it didn't fit, it doesn't fit with the Western propaganda to say, there were these, baby eating people. That wasn't the experience. As I said, if we had wanted to, and quite the opposite, they cared about their children. And one of the most moving things we did, we went to a refugee camp because the famines it was a very unlucky country, and the famines in 98 and 99 had meant there was no food, and a lot of thousands and thousands of Afghan children and people died. And we went to the refugee camps because they were displaced. And they brought us their dead children. They brought us, and they'd say, and it was made worse by the Western sanctions. And they'd say, you say that you don't like us because of women's rights or something, but here's my dead daughter. Yeah. How have you helped her? How have you helped her women's rights? She's dead now because you won't give us baby food or whatever it was. Yeah. All these sanctions, the same as Iran, which just killed the normal people. Yeah. Didn't achieve anything. And they just thought we were hypocrites. Well, they were pretty good. None of them ever said we're going to kill you because of that. Yeah. They just were kind of crying. Yeah. And sort of like, hurt, a bit like childlike. They were quite childlike, and I don't mean that in a patronising way, but they were in some ways, it's an admirable way, but they were quite hurt and confused as to why we weren't doing more to help them. And they particularly, this is the whole sort of idea that they hated Christians was wrong. They used to say things like, "We can't understand why you don't want to." The Americans. They didn't really understand what Australia was, but the Americans don't want to help us, because we're both kind of cowboys. You're cowboys, we're cowboys. We fight the bad guys, and they didn't see it in terms of Christianity versus Islam. Right. They kind of saw that they were both had a bit of a swagger, and they fought bad guys. They didn't like, and they were bemused. They would have loved to have had American support. It was nothing to do with it, but we like to paint it as a religious clash, but it wasn't. Yeah. And so they were frustrated, and they didn't like Osama bin Laden. There were Arabs there. It was another one. It's quite a funny story, because I was meant to be doing the security, and I was doing the security, and I'd become quite laid back and sort of like I thought. And at one point, we were in Kabul, and this guy came in, big guy, Arab guy, not Afghan. You could tell because he had his Arab scarf, and he came, and he had an AK. Everyone's got an AK. He came into the hotel. It was like a little sun lounge. I was lying on the sun lounge. It was, and I think we'd finished all the filming, and we had all the boxes. And he's panicking. He's quite a big guy, and he's got a beard. And he's like, "Who are you? Who are you?" And he's got an American accent. And a New Jersey accent, what I would consider New Jersey, a nasal sort of East Coast accent. And he's like, "Where's my neighbor? Where's my neighbor?" And he's got this AK, and he's pointing it at me, and everyone, "Where's my neighbor? Who are you?" And I was like, "Oh, go!" And I was just like, "Oh," I just lay there. I didn't even get off the banana chair. And he's like pointing the gun at me, "Who are you? Who are you? It's my neighbor." And I'm like, "We're just a TV crew. We're just doing a documentary. Your neighbour's gonna, come back." But he was, and we had our cameraman was, I don't know whether he was a spook or something. He was an English guy who'd been there for a long time, and he knew a lot. And he said, "That guy I said, afterwards, the crew were quite panicked because this guy was pointing this gun and he was sweating and he would look like he was going to shoot one of us. And then eventually we calmed him down and he walked out. And I said, the rest of the camera crew were like, fuck, that was pretty bad. And I was like, he was never going to kill anyone. He was never going to shoot anybody. I could tell he was nervous. And the cameraman, the English cameraman, said, no. He's a member of something called Al-Qaeda, which we never heard of. He's an Arab based here. He's been educated in America. And yeah, he would have killed you. And he would have not only killed you, but the Taliban would have buried your bodies in the rubbish dump tomorrow and nothing would have happened. And that was our first experience.
Whoa.
We'd never, I like to think, because I looked him up, because he had this sort of New Jersey nasally accent, I think it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And a friend of mine says, it wasn't him, because you see the photos of him after he'd been waterboarded 468 times. And yeah, he looks a bit different.
Yeah.
But the photos of him young, kind of chubby face, because he was a planner rather than any kind of operative, and he looks a bit like a sort of an accountant with a beard.
Yeah.
But he had lived in Virginia or somewhere, and I think this mother, and experienced a lot of racism and whatever, and he ended up with a real hatred of America. But he would have had an American accent.
Wow.
And so I underestimated him. He was certainly quite dangerous, but. It was kind of, you had experiences like, but the Afghans did not like them. They were taking their money, they were living there, but they were instantly recognisable. They spoke Arabic, not the local language. They had very pale white skin, and they had money, but they were living there as some sort of ruling class. But it was quite interesting because there wasn't really any love lost with them. So the idea that it was some sort of a Islamic conspiracy to take them. And one thing that the Taliban had no desire for world revolution, in the same way that the Soviets probably didn't either in the 60s and 70s. They were just trying to feed their people, get some sort of control, and they certainly didn't want to...
Well, the Chinese now.
Yeah, the Chinese now. Yeah, I would say, exactly.
So less than a year later, 9/11 happens, and of course there's straight away an invasion, bombing, and then an invasion of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much.
What did you think of the narrative of that at the time? Did you think, well, this doesn't really gel with what I know, or did you just accept it? What did you think?
I was probably a bit like the Taliban in the sense that I knew it was inevitable. And I think even they knew the game was up at that stage because they were, they were human beings, and they realised that whatever excuses they may have had to accommodate Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda had killed a lot of innocent people, and now there was going to be retribution. And I think that's why the CIA took over the country so quickly, was the Taliban kind of just threw down the arm. They didn't, because they felt bad about it. They had it's almost childlike, something in the West we don't accept, and we can't, and in some ways it's embarrassing that we can't accept it, because we have become so used to lies and double dealing and whatever. We can't believe that people might actually tell the truth and feel guilt, collective guilt, and not just want to lie. I think they did feel a fair bit of collective guilt. They put their weapons down and they got out. Certainly the accounts I've seen, they didn't really fight very hard. They were like, fuck, the game's up. We have these people under our guests have caused this problem. The Americans are rightly out for revenge. But then the Americans lost the moral high ground, I guess, because they didn't really know. I believe, and no one else really believes this apart from me, it's quite funny, I believe it was all a bit of an electoral stunt, and they were dropping bombs because it won it won votes. We could have settled that issue without invading it, and in fact, a very good international lawyer, who no one took seriously, because it was an emotional issue. people got emotional about it. Not surprising, seeing people, jump off the towers and things like that. It was it brought home death, but it didn't. It wasn't logical in that every day in the Middle East, people were getting killed, or in Africa or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
It wasn't as if it was the first time civilians had died. A lot of them in America's hand. I mean, how many people died in Cambodia? In a million or something that the Americans killed in fireballs, and yet no one cares about that. No one really thinks about it, but. It was emotional, and a good scholar said we don't really have the legal, we don't have the right to take over Afghanistan any more than if a terrorist group based in Broome attacked Indonesia. Indonesia would have the right to take over all Australia.
Yeah.
But that didn't matter. Americans do what they want, and also it wasn't really going to work, and they didn't really know what they were doing. But funnily enough, it was such a vote winner, and it happened so quickly. They felt they were already preparing for Iraq in 2002, early 2002, and that I found. This is something I've only found out relatively recently because I didn't know. But American friends of mine in the American military confirmed that. But I've also read reputable books to say that they were given orders for Iraq long before the whole weapons of mass destruction thing came out.
Well, the famous one is Wesley Clark himself, the former NATO commander, said the week after 9/11, he was given this list. We're going to go to all these countries. 7 countries in 7 years.
Yeah, and he's hardly, conspiracy theorist. That's right, yeah. And it's funny, but no one really seems to care. But that's, for me, for someone who's a professional soldier, that stuff matters. The idea that we lied about the weapons of mass destruction, the idea that it was all a bit of a game, it was all for long-term US geopolitical, that makes my blood boil, because good soldiers die for bullshit, and I don't agree with that.
No, what's fascinating to me, the fact you just said that strikes a chord. So when you say as a professional soldier, the motive the soldier takes to war is important. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
And it's got to be based on the truth.
We don't know. You go to Sandhurst, and I used to think Duntram, I'm not sure, but you actually believe in that stuff, in truth and honour. And we go there to fight the bad guys, the Nazis who are putting Jews in concentration camps and killing them, and that's wrong. We're going to stop that. But the idea, you're not just fighting for whatever your politician wants. If it's bullshit, that's outrageous. You have to have the moral high ground. Not only is that what we teach, you won't win, and that's one of the reasons why we've lost Vietnam. We've lost it. We've never had the moral high ground.
Yeah.
And I feel it very strongly. That's why I'm in the position, and we'll get to that, where I am. It matters. The truth matters. Morals matter. You can't go to war and kill people. And if you are actually the bad guys, it's not some sort of a game of football. You're meant to be fighting for some sort of principle which represents what you stand for. That principle is meant to be good. It can't be just to put the other guys down because they're an economic threat. That may be what it is, but for a soldier, that's not good enough for me. I'm not going to accept that. Especially when we keep telling people we are the good guys and we believe in all that shit. We have to put our money where our mouth is. And someone like me, I just had to swear an oath and I took it seriously. It meant something to me.
So when and why did you enlist in the Australian Army?
It's a good question. I missed the British Army. It was some of the happiest years of my life. I was trying to do a TV series, couldn't get another TV series off the ground. Got a job as a lawyer, which I didn't love, but as a civilian lawyer. And I'd heard that you could get a bit of, I was a barrister, criminal barrister, you get a bit more work if you were doing court martials when you're in your early days. And so I looked into it, and I quite enjoyed it. I was going to then do reservist. I was going to do reserve commando sort of stuff. And someone said, don't bother doing that. You'll just, doing the British Army, it'll be boring. And so I started doing the court-martial trials, and I quite enjoyed it. And my wife said to me, look, you obviously really like working for the government, the public service, or whatever, doing service. You can want to join full time. So I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, I joined full time, and it was a big deal to me. You get to choose your day. I chose the 15th of December, which is my birthday.
Right.
And I went to the Parramatta recruiting office, and I swore on the Bible. They were a bit bemused that I was rejoining after being in the British Army, and I was older. But I genuinely wanted to do something good for this country and put my life on the line to protect it. And I was pretty proud of it. I was a believer again. My grandfather had been in the Western Front. He'd been wounded over there. He was a stretcher bearer. He wasn't any great hero, and he never talked about it. But yeah, I thought that the Australian Army would be something. It was kind of a second chance in my career. I thought this would be really, really good, and I enjoyed the first couple of years. I was at Holdsworthy, then I went to Townsville, and I loved Townsville. I had a couple of kids. We enjoyed the whole Queensland experience, and I went to Afghanistan with the infantry brigade based at Townsville. And
what year was your first deployment? You went twice to Afghanistan, right?
I went twice. 2011 was my first deployment, most of 2011. And I mean, it's good. They were good people, and it's a very professional outfit. The average, person in the Australian Army is, even the private soldiers, are pretty smart, really highly motivated, and that much impressed me. But it was it was very political, and I could see that even from the first trip.
How so? What?
Well, Julia Gillard visited at the time, and as Prime Minister, and as did Tony Abbott, as a leader of the opposition. And we were briefing them and saying, "Oh, look, it's all going well. A lot of PowerPoint. We're going to win next year, basically." But we'd said that the year before, and the year before, and the year before, and we didn't really believe it. But people it was a good news operation. And there were a lot of similar ones back in Australia.
By then it'd been going 10 years.
Yeah.
2011.
And we weren't going to win next year.
Yeah.
We were going backwards. But it was just about putting out good news, because that's all everyone wanted to hear. The minister wanted to hear good messages. Everybody wanted to say. It was one of the standing jokes amongst us. So it was all right when I left, which was like, as long as you fucking you put up the window dressing as much as you can, and everything's supported by gaffer tape and bamboo, and then you get out before it all collapses. And if it collapses on the next guy, it's their fault. But that's what we knew, and it annoyed me again as a professional soldier, because if you keep on, you're only going to fail if you just keep repeating failures. It's a bit like Enron, saying that we're making profits and we're not making profits. It's all going to collapse eventually.
I don't know this much about Afghanistan like I do Iraq, but in terms of a forever war, was there a lot of private contractors in Afghanistan like in Iraq making money out of this forever war?
There was a huge amount, yeah. And it was a huge amount. And I've heard rumours that, and they sound true, it sounds big deal, but those contractors were paying subcontractors to attack the bases because there was so much money in keeping it going.
Wow.
Money beyond our comprehension. And this is one of the things about the wars, that again, it's a step too far for most people who want to talk about war crimes and individual, but the fact of the matter is that these wars make money for us. I don't go as far as saying that that's why the war started, but once they're on, once the public wants a war, a bit like the war on drugs or something, once it's got political impetus, there is money to be made, big money. Or like even the refugees, for example. I mean, the people that deal with that, Paladin and whatever, they make big money. And I think it's where we turn public money into private money. And that $6 trillion went somewhere.
Yeah.
And what I believe would happen is that someone would build a base, get a contract to build a base. The contract would be for 100 million. It probably only cost 50 million to build. 25 million goes into the pockets of all the directors, and say 10 million would go back to the Republican and Democrat parties to keep them happy, to make sure they get another contract. DynCorp, they was big money in that, and that's why they wanted the wars to go on, because the taxpayer money ended up in private hands, their friends' hands, Halliburton, etc. And yes, it was money that taxpayers that they couldn't get their hands on. It was a way to direct it basically into their own pockets.
So you're in Afghanistan and seeing that this is quite political. At this stage, are you questioning the geopolitical narratives, the overarching narratives?
I think it's slowly, and it's. We talked about this last night and I've got to write a book about it. So it is interesting about. It's like you change slowly, and then quickly. I am beginning to question the. I knew Abu Ghraib come out by then,
right?
And also one of the things about that is that that they found a couple of scapegoats, corporals at the bottom, but no one above corporal.
Some rednecks from southern states of America copped it all.
Reserve, part timers, and nobody from the top at all, and that bothered me. You can, like in anyone in any organisation, you kind of have a little bit of black humour about it. One of the things I thought was quite interesting about that, I used to laugh because I used to give lectures about, rules of engagement and not torturing. But when I looked into, researched that, the torturers, because they had tortured people to death, were wanted for investigation, and there was one from the CIA, I think, one from the DOD, and there was a third person who was from neither place, and it just made me laugh to think that they were some sort of freelance torturer, that they wanted to be a torturer, but they didn't join the CIA, they didn't join the DOD, they did some sort of Cert 4 and torture at the local TAFE, and it went kind of beyond. I've felt increasingly uncomfortable about it, but they were incidences of bad, bad soldiers, I would guess, and you can excuse them. There's always going to be bad soldiers, and this is I guess this is the point I made in relation to that WikiLeaks video. Collateral murder. Yeah. It's not so much the helicopter pilots shooting people that they think have got weapons and don't, or what bad as that is, and them talking about it in very cowboyish sort of terms. What was really bad about that was that the generals in charge of that area doctored the video to make it look like nothing had gone wrong, and they knowingly put out a false video to try to get the world's press off their back. Now that is a real problem. Yep. I didn't know that at the time, but once you get bad people at the bottom of the organisation who are going to make mistakes and do crazy shit, when you have that many people out there. But once you start getting officers at a higher level who are getting involved in covering things up, we're starting to get towards a criminal organisation. Yeah. So I was beginning to get nervous, I guess, by my next tour.
So okay, you're now in Afghanistan on your second tour. Is this when you start seeing bad behaviour among Australian soldiers? Tell us what you discovered. What's the gist of your discovery?
It's funny because I talk about it did take me a while. It's a bit like literally the straw that breaks the camel's back, or that drip, drip, drip of water where it suddenly goes over the edge. Because it was relatively small. It was a significant incident, but it wasn't necessarily anything that you would. the uninitiated person would see it as a problem. I increasingly thought that it was more from an Australian point of view. The Defence Force was being used as a political advertising agency.
Right.
Like, putting women first or whatever, that was a huge thing, which had nothing to do with truly putting women first, but everything to do with making the minister look good.
Yep.
A glossy brain. I mean, there was no substance in it at all.
Yep.
It was just, that's what the polling says, people like that, let's do that.
Yeah.
And then had it been, wearing, orange uniform, they would have done whatever the polling said. And that was a thing, so they did that. Pretty much everything that we knew about the Defence Force was, you see it now, it only occurred to me recently. We have these people in Canberra, you would know them, you'd speak to them, called staffers, political staffers. And, or no, not so much staffers, advisors, they're called advisors.
Yeah.
And I couldn't work it out, and Kevin Wright had them on. Often they're like 30 years old or late 20s.
Yep.
And you think, and they might be advisor on defence, and you think, well, hang on, this person doesn't know anything about defence. They've never been in the military. They don't, they don't have a master's degree, and it took me a while. What these advisors advise on, or all they advise on, is how to be more popular. They've got a communications degree or something, and it's all about say this and people will like you. Say wear this shirt, people will like you. And they got no idea, and nor do they care about what will actually work. And they are like cockroaches through Parliament House.
That's right.
And they are. It came up in all the trials. Yeah, there's people that actually know nothing about actually running. They're not married, or they're nothing about actually life, but they know a lot about advertising and selling things.
Apparently Scott Morrison took it to the nth degree. He had the biggest army of these communications people to the point that when he went into his multiple COVID lockdowns, he went in there with his cameraman. The cameraman had to be in lockdown with him so they could get photo shoots every day, etc. Because it's all about communication, right? Feeding the public.
Yeah. No, it is, and it's it's not just them. Bob Carr did it. I mean, it's become a real sickness, but yeah, that's what they do. And when they came to visit in Afghanistan, all they really cared about was getting the story, getting a popular story. And we've heard, I didn't know this at the time, but we've heard this sensationally in the Ben Robert Smith defamation case that he wasn't on the top of the shortlist for the Victoria Cross, but he was elevated would have been by one of those staffers, 23-year-old,
really,
Angus, who thought because he's so handsome and he gives a good press conference and he'd be the great person to meet the Queen or the Governor General. And
he's like chiselled out of Ayers Rock or something.
Yeah, exactly. And a much better ambassador. You noticed that all the VC, well, apart from Donaldson, I think, who totally deserved it, but someone who was going to look good at the press conference, better than someone that fought right alongside him and was just as brave, but might be a little bit rough around the edges and wasn't necessarily going to, mind his P's and Q's at the, Government House. And that's how sick it had become. And that sort of stuff is corrosive. For a professional soldier, the idea that you would elevate someone and push someone else down, even though that other person was the more deserving soldier, simply because, my blood boils just talking about it even now. I mean, that is poison. That is the most, and this is why I've got I can't stand David Hurley, because he presided over that time and everything was about publicity. And it's his job to say, no, enough. We're soldiers, we fight wars, we don't fight political ads.
Yeah.
But he didn't, and I understand why he didn't, because he wouldn't have got to where he was unless he was a yes man. But still, it was very disappointing for me.
So are you saying that contributed to the culture that influenced the soldiers that then did the bad stuff?
There was a constant sort of tug of war going on in the Defence Force between people who were good, people who wanted to do the job properly, and people who were just bullshit and wanted to get ahead and do whatever the minister wanted.
Right.
Most of the people at the top were like that. Yeah, I think it did contribute. Well, why would soldiers do the right thing and not lie if their generals lie? And while you get, and the generals would say, "Oh, it's not lying; it's just carrying out political objectives for the sake of the government." But it's lying. If it's lying, it's lying. And they. And this is one of the challenges for me. We get outraged, rightly so, the idea that a soldier may have shot a civilian and then planted a weapon on him and taken a photo and said, oh, he was Taliban. But generals did the same thing. It wasn't as graphic, but yeah, they made up stuff and they said, oh, this is a victory when it's not a victory. We are winning when we're not winning. And that lack of an army is like a religion. It's like, this is why the Vikings were good. If you're going to be decent, people have to be believers and they have to be quite fanatical. We keep it secret because no one really wants to hear that. But obviously, you are quite different. You can be sent to your death, and you can't even complain. You can't kind of call your union and say I might die. That's your job. But you shouldn't be bullshitted to. It's almost the opposite of the civilian world. And we don't like to talk about it, but it's it's part of my job if you're the enemy to get a bloody bayonet and stick it through your eye. That's what it's one of the first things you learn how to do when it's quite confronting for normal people, but that's what you get trained to do.
Well, let's go through this systematically because I want to make sure people get the details here. What did you see that you blew the whistle on, and how did you first complain? What process did you go through?
I'll do a little bit of introduction. There was, as we've seen from the Brereton report, there were a lot of allegations about what went on in 2012, Ben Robert Smith's final tour. Talk about murders.
Were you there then?
No, I was there in 11 and 13. But I was in Special Forces headquarters at the time.
Oh, okay.
So include listening, hearing things.
Yeah.
And there was like the inquiries. So talk about getting the most kills and competition for kills. Yeah. So I went over in 2013, and something happened in 2013, which I already picked up on before I got in Afghanistan. There became a bit of hysteria from the leadership. They put out a new rules of engagement and started talking about murder. And I asked, but this is before I even went, I said, hang on, why have we changed the rules of engagement? We don't seem to have a problem. And the chief legal officer said something like, oh, we've found out that if you can even comply with the rules of engagement and you still could be guilty of murder under Australian law. Now, we don't need to go into all legal, but that was wrong, and it was strange. Now, I just suddenly thought, well, hang on. It was a really discordant note that you would sometimes feel, I didn't know what was going on, but I said, hang on, that's weird, because that's wrong. And when I dug in, I just got told basically, shut up, move along, above your pay grade. Then we also had, this is in before I went to Afghanistan, we had something called the Jedi Council, which was this thing, which was painted into this huge, thing, which was actually, it was an obscene email trail. Now, why that wasn't great, but it didn't deserve a national press conference before, and apart from anything else, that was against the law that you would hold a press conference talking about something before they had any trials. The police can't do that. They got away with it because there was so much hysteria. But again, I thought it was strange, and I wasn't involved in any way, so I didn't have it. I was just a lawyer observing, and I thought we seem to be creating smoke screens, jumping it.
Oh, yeah.
It's just changed. 2013, everything starts going crazy in defence, and I get over there, and we have an incident which is a relatively normal incident. An SAS soldier who's got an impeccable record, he's done 6 tours, no reason to believe he's got some axe to grind. He shoots a Taliban person and there's a witness to say the Taliban tried to grab his weapon, and a witness says, yeah, they fought over it and he shot him. And we try to put that guy in jail for murder, the government does. Now I'm like, well, hang on, something is... And I interviewed a few people, and I got some confidential information to say bad things happened in 2012. You do not... And I started to put two and two together to say, hang on, because we didn't do any investigations in 2012. Right. It's like we were doing the shell game. We were suddenly jumping at shadows. We're investigating anything.
Right.
We investigated, an Apache gunship which shot the wrong target, an American pilot. So it could not have possibly been an Australian crime. We tried to treat that as a murder, and it looked like we were creating smoke screens and in order to cover up. And why would we do that? Because Ben Roberts-Smith and the other people were all very, very decorated heroes, and if they were investigated, and none of that, what they did was even looked into. A lot of generals and politicians would have come down to, because when you imagine how embarrassing, they'd go back and say, here's you are pinning a medal on a guy who's just blown away someone for fun. And so I believe that, but they knew the story was going to come out, and they wanted to find some scapegoats. Very cynical, we were going back, but very cynical, relatively complex PR operation, where they just think, it's almost as if you got the guys that run BHP, PR or whatever, and they have quite a complex but workable PR plan to say, how can we manage, was it issue management, reputation management? If you've got people with a whiteboard and a plan to say, we are going to manage this reputational risk with this complicated stuff. Now, and what clued me onto something was, every time I asked questions about it, I got threats. I got shut up. I got you're crazy. They psychologically reviewed me twice. Mandatory. They just said, you're going to see this. And the psych passed me. She said he's very angry, but he's not mad, which was true. I was very angry.
And you're just asking questions at this point.
Yeah, I'm just saying, hang on. But it was the procedure was. It wasn't even like Richard Balls. The procedure said, we will in such and such, we will in Y case we will do X, and we weren't doing that, and nothing had changed. So I was like, well, why? Yeah, and they just like, shut up, we're going to review, and it particularly annoyed me because I was like, well, hang on, I'm a lawyer, I'm a major. It's exactly my job to make sure we do the right thing. So don't tell me this is not important, because they were like, get back to your day job. And I was like, this is my day job. What do you think my day job is? But they kind of gaslight you. In fact, they did send me to they sent me to a psychiatrist who said I didn't have a leg to stand on legally, because I told him I was going to become a whistleblower. Well, I was thinking about becoming a whistleblower. And he said, you wouldn't legally be able to do that, which is rubbish. But when he's a doctor anyway. So it was a weird, they played very underhand, and I couldn't see the full picture, but I could see that they were lying and they were covering things up. And you have to take a bit of a gamble at such a point. And you have to sort of make a decision about what you're going to do. But I couldn't, with good conscience, not do anything. And it was my conscience that I was trying to, satisfy. And this is one of the things about my case. I don't know that I will get up under the public interest disclosure defence, which under that act, which just comes up in 3 weeks, because, and I'll say this to the judge, it was never my intention to avoid jail. It was my intention to get change in the government departments. And so I did speak to journalists before. In order to get protection, you're meant to make sure the internal inquiry is totally finished before you go and see journalists. Now, I had no faith at all in the internal inquiry. When you make an internal inquiry in the Department of Defence or or anywhere, it's looked at by the very people you're complaining about. So not surprisingly, it's going to be likely to get down.
Yeah.
But I did make an internal inquiry, and I still had a career. I loved my job. It was a really good job for me, half soldier, half lawyer, and I was hoping, I wanted to keep it. So it was relatively stiff upper lipped, I guess, diplomatic, to say, hang on, I get there was a war, I get that we have geopolitical, things to worry about, but I said there's a limit to how much we can just make shit up, and we need to be careful about the law and the truth. And I was trying to be subtle about it, and I was hoping that they might say, yeah, we got a bit carried away. Thank you for pointing it out, but it didn't. It had the opposite effect. They were like, fuck you, how dare you question, us. You are now the enemy. And I had a really good career. You don't get to be the legal advisor to Task Force 66 and Special Operations Command, and without being considered one of the best in your cohort.
Yeah.
But then suddenly my career really tanked, and it was all over. That didn't scare me because it just made me want to dig in. I thought, this is exactly what we are meant to do. We're meant to stand up, and I'm using my own, all the stuff they trained me to do. They would have trained me to say, you don't give up just because things get a bit tough.
So when did it go from being questions to you actually not figuring out something really bad had gone on here?
Well, I put in
it took me about a year.
I put in a complaint, a written complaint, 1 year, well, pretty much after I got back from Afghanistan. Not quite, about 8 months.
So what, 2014?
2014, late August 2014, and they took a year to look at it. Well, they looked at it. They took a year to come back to me, and they said nothing wrong. And I was like, well, that's a lie, but because things were clearly wrong. But yeah, so I could see that we weren't following the law. We were just putting out false statements. We were looking for scapegoats, and the rumours were abounding that there had been a lot of war crimes. As I said, it was not so much the soldiers. Never been for me. It's never been about bad soldiers or war crimes. They're a symptom of a much bigger problem. If it was just a matter of some corporals, shooting, we could fix that relatively easily by having a few trials for the corporate. It's a much, much more insidious problem. It's not so much about the last war for me, it's about the next war. If we're a bullshit organisation that just makes stuff up according to whatever, political winds are blowing that day, we're going to lose every war, and we're going to be going into, very false wars all the time.
So hang on, let me be clear on this. When you eventually go to the media and blow the whistle, you're not so much in your mind blowing the whistle on the bad actions of Australian soldiers. You're blowing the whistle on the system.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was your motivation.
And that was one of the problems I had, because it was too big. It's too big, you'd never see it. The days of Watergate, I was expecting it was like Watergate for me, and I was hoping that I wouldn't lose my career. In the best case scenario, someone would start asking hard questions to the Prime Minister or Minister or whatever, and they wouldn't be able to answer them. Yeah, but I was different, and I was hoping that there'd be a seismic change, fall of government as a result of these idiosyncrasies, the fact that they get caught out lying. Now, it didn't turn out like that because it was people don't really want to know that the whole system might be stuffed, that we are an organisation that habitually lies. And that was what I was really worried about. And so, but I've been lucky. I've had a lot of luck. The story of the Afghan Files came out. It did talk about war crimes, and it had enough of what I was saying. It was definitely implying that the leadership knew or didn't do enough about it.
Can I ask how you got those files?
I downloaded them off the sort of defence internet. Well, I had the top security clearance, so I could see them, and they were all confidential files on the.
You went looking for them to figure out what had gone on the year before.
In that 8
2012.
months,
Yep,
in that
yep.
8 months, I came back. I came back from Afghanistan in 2013, very angry.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to go to war on the leadership.
So you knew something had gone badly wrong
Yeah.
and it was being covered up. That's what you knew.
I
Okay.
knew.
Yeah.
I knew the organisation was rotten.
Yeah.
You know, it was not fit for purpose. And particularly, again, I didn't come from some sort of do-gooder. It was more like, we are not going to win a war against Fiji the way we're going, because we just make shit up. We make heroes up that are not heroes. We're villains that are not villains. You know, I saw it. I felt quite vindicated, tragic as it is for the people of Afghanistan. But a little over a year ago, and when the regime that we built at the cost of $6 trillion or whatever it was collapsed in a week.
Yeah.
You know, with the president running away with millions of dollars in his helicopter or whatever. That was the sort of, and no one seems to, remember that. That epitomised us as a defence force. That is what we created. That was as bad as good. Not that they weren't good soldiers, but that's bullshit.
Yeah.
And that was what I was fighting against. To say everything you think you know about it is all an ad. It's all just made up by some pimply staffer in Russell, and it has no conception in reality. And it worries me because these people are meant to be defending our country. We're meant to be defending our children in the future. Well, they've got no idea about actually defending Australia. Everything is about what's the next glossy brochure on Afghanistan or whatever, and that's what really made me angry. To say we're not protecting Australia.
And General David Hurley, who is now our Governor General, was in charge of all this.
He was in charge of all of this, exactly, and it's absolutely part of central to being a military officer is that the person at the top takes responsibility. He was interestingly enough, he went from Chief of the Defence Force to Governor of New South Wales, and Governor of New South Wales to Governor General. He's someone politicians like, and they don't just like him because there are plenty of other, Chief of Defence Forces that haven't become Governor General.
Sure.
And what's the discriminator? And I reckon he was someone that did what they wanted. And I think this has been borne out in the McMinistry thing when he signed off on questionable appointments, didn't get second opinions, didn't tell anybody about it. And I think while that's not maybe the crime of the century, it does show he's the sort of person that will do whatever politicians ask him to do without even...
Yeah, the first time Morrison comes to him and says, I want to make myself health minister, maybe David Hurley had forgotten there was already a health minister. But after he comes back and says, I want to be Home Affairs Minister and I want to be Defence Minister, I want to be this minister and that minister, you would have thought, hang on, there's already ministers for there. Why didn't he question this?
I think they told Greg Hunt and Melbourne, but they didn't tell the others. Now,
that's right.
So
that's right.
As I said, as a barrister, you'd say that is indicating of guilt. They didn't even tell them, and there was no photo opportunity or anything like that. You'd say,
exactly.
And Hurley loves a photo opportunity with this pen and the photo of the portrait of the Queen. He loves that, but they didn't do any of that. And as a barrister, you'd say, this indicates you knew it was wrong. And I don't think it was a coincidence he became Governor General, because he was they knew he was the sort of guy that would do what he's told.
So when you're thinking about leaking the Afghan files, was he personally in your sights saying, I want this whole thing cleaned up?
Well, they're all as bad as each other, but yeah, he's always been my... I like to see it in military terms, and they have something called the Joint Prioritised Effects List, which is basically the kill capture list, the target list. He's always been my number one because he was in charge, and it was hard for me because people had this very a positive image of him, and even friends of mine used to say, "Don't attack Hurley. Everybody loves Hurley." But sometimes you can do the most terrible things just by looking the other way.
Yeah.
And I think he was that kind of guy. He just allowed all sorts of complete trashing of the officer ethos by not standing up for his own people. Like, for example, when that guy cut off, it's just hard for an SAS corporal who was a very, had a good record. He cut off the hand of the dead Taliban to have it so they could fingerprint. He was in a hurry. There was a firefight going on, and it was on a windy mountaintop, a dangerous position. And unless you've done that kind of stuff yourself, you really shouldn't be criticised. I mean, he said, I was in a hurry. I wanted to take the sample. And Hurley totally, rather than supporting his guy and saying, well, he made a difficult decision and it wasn't, because it turns out it wasn't illegal, even though it might have turned people's stomachs. Hurley did not even defend that soldier, and that turned my stomach to say you've got to stand up for your people, and that's what a general does. The politician might not like if they sack you. So what? You've done 40 years. There's nowhere for you to be promoted to. It turns out there was somewhere for me to be promoted. At some point,
right.
You're meant to say, I'm gonna stick up for my people rather than just do what you want because you.
So an incident like that, as distasteful as it is, he doesn't defend his soldier.
No.
With real war crimes, he covers them up.
Yeah.
So let's get back to you though. When you decide to leak these documents, how fearful were you?
I was angry more than fearful, and again, I guess because I saw it as a military mission. I saw it was my duty. I felt like a bit of a spy, and it was kind of comical at times. So I had to get a lot of secret documents out of the, and this is typical. It's a bit like the Optus thing for all the, and I'm sure Optus spent millions of dollars on cyber, and yet they did, and they probably had conferences and they had brochures and whatever, world's best practice, but actually some, hacker could just, it just was like, whatever, the store was open. But same, in that they had these iris scanners and they had hand scanners and all that kind of stuff, but I just managed to walk out with all these secret documents, and someone would have been paid millions and millions and millions of dollars for this security arrangement, which did not work for him.
So you didn't have to do anything as elaborate as Edward Snowden.
No.
Rubik's Cube and all that.
I didn't. Unfortunately, I didn't. Somebody like Snowden, I knew that you'd have to, butter up the security guards and be very nice to them and talk about the football and whatever and distract them, because they did have to, they did check your bags, but if you were friends with them, they might not. And they had this stupid system where they tried to stop you taking secret documents out of the building because they had pink paper, bright pink paper in the secret document printer. But next to it was this sort of unclassified printer with white paper. So guess what? And they weren't locked. So yeah.
That's simple.
Yeah. You put the white paper in one and you printed out secret stuff on white paper and you walked out and they'd say, is that secret? Oh no, it's white paper.
Oh, no.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and we're going to go to war with China?
Yeah, exactly. And these are the sort of people that take, millions and millions and millions of dollars from the taxpayer money for, security. And it wasn't that hard. In fact, I even got them to help me carry, because I had so many secret files, I had to get help to carry that. Can you carry the, yeah, thank you so much. And but I was angry, and I went home and I told my wife and I said, look, the cops could be coming soon, and because I knew that it was going to come out. And I wasn't sure how she'd take it. She knew it'd been death by 1,000 cuts for us, and that I would come home each day and say, this is bullshit, this has happened now. And so she knew, but still, it's a big step to get your wife to sort of become accessory after the fact to a sort of major national security crime. And I didn't know whether she'd say, oh my God, I don't want the embarrassment of the cops coming in. But she said, bring it on, She was happy, because she was so angry herself. She was really angry herself. When I went to Afghanistan the second time, it was very hard for her the first time. She didn't. Defence have the ultimate.
Because she encouraged you to join the army.
Yeah, she didn't. I would never have joined.
And enjoyed life up to a certain point.
Yeah, well, she was from the eastern suburbs of Sydney. She wouldn't have had any friends, and actually, funnily enough, she had done Army Reserve But again, all her friends thought she was quite nuts. But so she did have some sort of, it was very out of her family, out of her background, having to do with the army. So, and I didn't think she'd want to become an army wife, but she did. And we went to Townsville and totally lived that whole army, and she loved it. But so yeah, I couldn't have done it without her doing it. So she's always been a big part of my life. And
But when your attitudes changed and you're bringing all this baggage home, she's getting angry at the corruption that's making
bullshit.
you so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. She saw them on a couple of different levels that they talked about being family friendly, and they talked about women and girls and blah blah blah. They had all this the pimply staffers couldn't get enough glossy brochures about how good they were, but they didn't visit her, they didn't call her, they didn't do it. She was a forgotten person as far as the military was. So she just began to hate them as much as I did, she could see they were just full of bullshit.
Yeah.
And they said one thing and did totally another. And while they'd say, "Oh, we're all about women and girls," but she was a woman, and my daughters were women. And yet they were happy for this time that they'd been psychologically reviewing me, and they would have been happy for me to kill myself. I think they were trying to drive me to suicide. And so she used to say, "Well, what about your daughters? They're women. They don't seem to care about them." So they didn't really care about this gender. It was all just window dressing to make themselves look good, and they were trying to grind me into the ground. So she really didn't like, but still I was impressed that she was like, I'm behind you the whole way.
No, that is impressive. A lot of partners would have been very upset at their husbands for bringing all this down on them. Now, is it fair to say though, David, or is it accurate to say you felt you had to flee the country?
Yeah, I knew. It took a while for the ABC to put them the documents up online, but they did. The Afghan Files, and they ran that story. And I knew that I'd be in the frame for it, because they've actually...
This is 2018, right?
This is 2017.
2017.
They put it up, yeah. And they used you could see it was the original documents that I'd printed off, and some of them I think had my hand scrawls on them.
Right.
And it wouldn't have, even with defence, wouldn't have been rocket science for them to sort of do a scan and say who printed all these documents, and it would have come up with one name. Not that they would have needed to know that, because I'd been agitating within the organisation for like 4 years by this stage, and so they knew all about me. I was going to be arrested, and then so I took off to Spain. I thought I would go and get a job with the Red Cross because I had that skill and rules of engagement, and I had to learn Spanish. Spain was kind of good because it was extradition. I knew from Christopher's case, extradition was a little bit harder from Spain.
You from Christopher's case.
I was going on. And they contacted me, the AFP contacted me and said, we'd like, my wife called that, so before that, Sarah called me and said the cops have raided your house. We'd separated by this stage. And they've taken all the documents. And I was like, oh my God. First I was like, why didn't I destroy them? And then afterwards I thought, no, your reason you didn't destroy them was because you didn't feel like a criminal, and you always wanted to keep them so you could prove what you were saying was true. And had I destroyed them, and then it had come out there what I'd done, and they tried to put me in jail, I would have lost the chance to defend myself by saying, no, everything was really wrong in defence. So I kept them to protect myself. And I'm glad I did now, because eventually I decided to come home and face trial, and that was one of the big reasons to do that, because I knew that I had the documents there, so I could try to prove my case and to say I was obliged to do what I did, not just had the right, but I was obliged as a lawyer and as an officer, because the Defence Force, in my opinion, was not fit for purpose, and I had to do something about it. They weren't going to fix themselves.
Well, let's reverse it. What if you knew what you knew, felt what you felt, and did nothing?
Yeah, well, I think
why wouldn't that be the crime?
I think it is a crime. Yeah. I mean, yeah, after all the training, and that's what made me sick. There's a lot of training. There's a lot of, and if you get higher than me, staff college, and they have a thing called baby general school, they spend millions. And they could tell you a story that would bring a tear to your eye about leadership or whatever. But and it made me sick to think that they actually do the opposite. It's a bit like the pedophile priest thing, in that it's particularly bad in that they were saying one thing and doing the absolute opposite, and that turned my stomach. They knew all about leadership. They knew all about doing the right thing, and I think it would have been a crime for me not to have done anything.
Yeah. So when you went to Spain, how'd it go, and why did you come back?
I had, I've got two daughters, and one of them was still in primary school, and one of them was just starting senior school, boarding school. And the oldest one went back to boarding school. Quite expensive. My in-laws were paying for it. And the younger one was staying with me in Spain and was going to go to school in Spain. But the older one was really missing me. And we were going to stay, my wife and I, we all discussed it. We went in the school holidays, we went on a trip in the Sahara Desert, which was great. We rode camels and we sat out under the stars one night, and we discussed it. We had like a family meeting, and I said, look, I think I might have to go back and go to jail, or at least, have a trial. And they were like, okay, everyone's sad, quite a few tears, but we thought, yeah, okay, do it. But we thought we'd have one last white Christmas in Europe. We go skiing or something like that. And because at the time, we assumed that there was a good chance that I wouldn't just go to jail, but I'd go to jail for a long time. So we thought, well, you may as well have a couple of months together if that's going to happen. And it might be the last time I see my kids. Then my daughter called me, the one that was back in Australia. She called me and she said, I need you to come back for a father-daughter dance. And I was like, I sent her this kind of funny, I sent her this long video saying, I'd love to, but I'll probably get arrested. And if I do, and if I get arrested, I'll go to jail for a long time. And I was sure that she'd say, well, that doesn't matter. But she was like, I still want you to come back. And being the dad that I was like, oh, okay. I thought maybe I can fly in really quickly and fly out again before they get me. So I came, I flew in on the Saturday. I didn't tell her I was coming back because I thought I might get arrested at the airport coming in. But I got, friends to sort of take her to the dance, and I was going to surprise her. They didn't arrest me at the airport, but they clocked me. The guy sort of, when he was talking to me, he's like, "Oh, have a nice holiday." And he's like, you can see he's pressing the button underneath,
right, yeah,
underneath the thing. And they went through all my bags, and they were like trying to be really friendly. And I think they probably followed me around that weekend. But to their credit, they didn't arrest me then, and it would have really broken me if I'd come back to see my daughter and they'd chucked me straight in the cell. They didn't. I don't know whether they were trying to see. I was going to go and see my Chinese contacts or whatever. But then of course my daughter didn't want me to leave. She hadn't seen me for 6 months. I've still got video because she was very emotional.
Oh, because you got to pull this thing off at the dance. You turned up at the
turned
dance.
up at the dance, and all the friends cried, and with joy, and just it was a very emotional night. And a beautiful night. And then my daughter, of course, would not stop holding on to me and did not want me to go. Said, look, I've got to get back on the plane. And she's like, well, no, you're not going. So we stayed. We just kind of hugged each other for a couple of days. And I had to sort of delay my flight back. And by this stage, because I knew there was a chance that just by pure the clunky bureaucracy, it might have been quite hard for them to get a warrant together.
Right.
And but they'd obviously, and I think that was a genuine problem. The warrant that they eventually arrested me on had only just been stamped. The ink was still wet, and that's why I think that they had this unusual charge of theft. They couldn't stop me leaving the country for for every single charge, but theft. If you stole a tank from a battleship, could be a very serious charge, and so it was big enough that they.
But you stole white paper.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it wasn't even like theft of of confidential information. It was theft of white paper. A couple of reams of reflex. Yeah, and I don't know whether they were just hoping I'd plead guilty to it. And it would be over and done with, or they just couldn't get anything around quicker. But yeah, it was a bit laughable to begin with. But because I wouldn't plead guilty, that they upped the charges. Anyway, they arrested me on the way out at the airport. They were waiting for me. There was no way I was going to get out. But the AFP were very pleasant. They didn't. I could have got shot because I put my passport in they've got these automatic machines which they had then. And it usually spins a couple of times and then the green light comes on. But for me, it just kept spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. And then a guy came out and said, "Come with me." And I was like, And then the cops didn't know, the New South Wales cops didn't, as far as they knew, I was Osama bin Laden, So it was pretty heavy to begin with. And then the AFP came up and they were like, "No, we'll take it from here." And they were very good. I mean, I always say that I'm not really anti-establishment, and if I've committed a crime, I'm happy to go down. I don't think I have, but the AFP were very pleasant to me, and they were very professional. They didn't cuff me. They could have. And that would have been tough. And they didn't even oppose bail. They put me in jail for one night down in Surrey Hills, and that was pretty confronting. And but they could have made it a lot worse for me had they, kept me in. They could have said, "Oh, he's a security threat," and they could have just kept me in prison for a long time. That would have been very tough for me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that because we've referred to last night a few times. We were at the same event with Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, and you are a fit, strong military guy. Assange is a nerdy publisher, yet he is treated much more brutally by the system, physically, shackled and all this kind of stuff.
Last
pretty
night,
awful.
I did feel quite guilty, yeah. Here I'm out on bail, I'm giving speeches, I'm showing movies, and I did like 16 hours, I think, in the cells. And I found, with all my training and whatever, I did not find it easy at all. It felt like months.
Right.
He has, and I think there are things that they don't even want to talk about, but I think he's been quite brutalised. And
no, that's tough.
Yeah.
So let's keep going through this. What are you now charged with? What are the charges that you got to answer to?
The 5 charges. So funnily enough, I don't even know them very well. I don't dwell on them too much. They relate to speaking to individual journalists, and one is Chris Masters. One is a guy that worked for the Herald, and one is I think the ABC. So they're separate charges, and they're quite oldie-worldy. They sort of talk about giving out the sketches of the sort of embankments or something, emplacements, gun emplacements.
Of the castle and the moats.
Yeah, giving out the secret tunnel to the castle.
Okay.
And it has this proviso in it, and it was not your duty to do so. And but I like that, and I want to be able to say, so it's not simply that you gave documents away. It is like it wasn't your duty, and I want to argue that it was exactly my duty. And I look forward to having that chance to do that, because I want it to be a test case. I don't want. This is what I want to say to the Australian people and your listeners. It's not about me. It's really about anyone who anyone has ever thought this is bullshit in relation to the government and how we have lost our way as a country, and we no longer do what's right for Australia. We no longer do what's right for the citizens. Like your policy platform, and the key ones from your party, they're so sort of common sense and clearly good things, and the idea that they are that's a sort of a fringe thing and not the mainstream is just it's enough to make your blood boil. That you wouldn't want to help the good, honest, hard-working Aussie against the banks, like they're not making enough money, etc. You wouldn't want to help refugees. You wouldn't want to help Assange, and it's also because for someone like me, I can see that it's not just it's lies. Everything that we think we know about the banks or any of those issues, the oil companies or whatever. It's all bullshit, They think nothing of making stuff up, and that would make your blood boil. So I'm fighting for everybody that's kind of said we have lost our way, and I want it to be a test case to say public servants are meant to work for the good of Australia. They're not just meant to carry out any kind of stunt that the minister wants in order to get the minister re-elected. Now, funnily enough, I think that this is how crazy we've got. There's not really that much in a normal criminal case. There's a lot of argument about what happened, whether John really did stab Stephen on the night. In my case, there's really not much argument on fact. Even my enemies would say, I've said I gave the documents, I was justified, and they would say, of course we do political stunts for the minister, but that's what we're meant to do. They don't even think that that's a problem. They think I'm the idiot. The idea that the Defence Force is not meant to do make shit up because the minister wants them to. They think that I didn't get the memo, and didn't I know that that's what they do?
This is how the world works, mate.
Yeah, exactly.
Accept it.
Didn't you know?
Yeah.
Don't fight the great. And so that's what it really comes down to, is deciding whether I'm crazy or not. In that sense, to say, does the government work for the government, or does the government work for the people of Australia? And I want that question to be definitively answered. And
when you say it's a test case, let's be clear. You had an alternative to this trial. You could have cut a deal before now and gone a different path.
Yeah. I mean, if I'd pled guilty to the theft of paper, for example, I certainly wouldn't have got any kind of prison sentence. Also, a big one, because I was discharged with a post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of people tried to push me down there. I could have easily said I'm going to sort of take some sort of say it was all because I've got imagined it all or something, and even people in my family, much to my annoyance, tried to push me down. Not my wife, but extended, and that used to make my blood boil as well. Say, look, I may have PTSD from fighting my organisation, but I certainly didn't imagine any of this shit. And
so they're trying to make up excuses for you, and you're not interested in that.
I'm not interested. No. Yeah, I'm not interested in saying if I've committed a crime, I'll go to jail. I want to. I don't think I have, but I'm certainly not going to say, pity me because I was a bit crazy that day. I believe I was right. My views haven't changed one iota in the last 10 years. I still feel as strongly as I've ever done, and I feel it's not about me avoiding jail. It's about me satisfying my conscience. Someone's got to stand up, and when I say that, I'm not criticising. I'm not judging other people in Australia. Yeah. Nobody has had. I'm just the unlucky guy that was on the spot. No one else has really been put in the position that I've been put in. But having been put in that position, I have to do what the country would expect me to do, and bloody well, stride out to the crease and give it a good go.
So for the trial, who do you want to hold accountable specifically, apart from people understanding how the system works? Do you want David Hurley to come to the trial?
I want him to give evidence, yeah. Funnily enough, and again, this for your viewers, this shows you how ridiculous the system is. I set out subpoenas to a number of obvious but not, key people who are absolutely reasonably connected to the case. The Minister of Defence at the time,
Right.
the Chief of the Defence Force at the time, the Secretary of Defence at the time, and the government lawyers. You would have thought they'd say, yeah, sure, that's fine. We've got nothing to hide. We'll come and give evidence. But they fought them tooth and nail. They said, taxpayer money was used to stop these people giving evidence. Like, what have they got to hide?
Yeah,
and why would the taxpayers have to pay? It's this weird thing that happens in Australia at the moment where team government absolutely goes against, team whistleblower. This is before they've even looked at the facts of my case. They just assume that the people at the top are good, they're right, and we will use all the taxpayer monies to defend them. And the person who's actually saying we need to do things for the benefit of Australia, they are necessarily wrong, and they're going to, we're going to crush them. Now that's just so topsy-turvy. And what have they got to fear by turning up and telling their story? I have to turn up and tell my story. And Hurley had the excuse to say, oh, I'm Governor General, I can't be subpoenaed, which is true. But it's kind of a cop-out to say, well, he can turn up voluntarily. Again, he might be Governor General now, but he was the Chief of Defence Force at the time. And I think most average Australians would say, you have a bit of a duty to turn up and answer questions. Maybe he'll exonerate himself. Maybe he'll look good, but don't just take the cowardly option and say, I'm not going to come. And this is what I've always wanted, because this is why I wanted a trial, because when you're trying to fight one of these big organisations, you hit an avalanche of PR people who are in the major media outlets are very slanted towards the government. They might give you a little bit of a run, but not that much. And you can be smeared, and it's very hard. They don't answer. They don't have the obligation to answer straight questions.
Yep.
And yet, in a courtroom, everything's different. There's no spin doctor in a courtroom.
Yes.
They can be put on the spot, and you can have that, that hard question: did you know or didn't you know? And then when they say, "Oh, I didn't know," and then you say, "Well, what about why did you do this?" And then they look more and more ridiculous. You can't do that outside of a courtroom, and it's a high risk strategy. And even though I'm the defendant, excuse me, we get to ask them questions, and I think I'm effectively putting them on trial. And as far as I could see, it was the only way I could do it. So I want that trial.
Now the difficulty though is there's a good chance this trial is effectively going to be secret. How can they make sure it stays secret?
Well, the coverall that everyone's been abusing for the past 20 years is to say matters of national security are being discussed. And we talked about it last night. Greg Barnes was talking about it. It's disgusting that under our system, and the hysteria after 9/11, the prosecution can have evidence that the defendant's not even allowed to see.
Yeah.
And can show it to the judge. And this kind of might have seemed like a good idea at the time after 9/11. But the problem is we cannot trust our security services anymore, that's not totally made up. That piece of paper that goes under the judge's nose could be a complete piece of bullshit. And we need to, the idea that the defence don't get to see it. So there'll be things like that they'll be saying, they could even have evidence against me, which we don't get to see. Probably not in my case, but as they say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And while it's not totally necessary for me to have an open trial, I've got faith in the an open trial. I've got faith in the judiciary. I think I've got a pretty good judge, a very good judge. And of course, you have to have the legal argument over whether it's going to be open or closed. And it's been going on for 10 years. I'm not interested in running that. I've got 2 teenage children who are rapidly under pressure. I can't afford to run that argument forever. And if we have to, and the government's always got the winning hand in that regard. They've got limitless money to spend on this. Yep. So I don't know how much is going to be closed and how much is going to be open, but we will. It's ridiculous to say, there is any genuine questions of national security for any of the major facts. Like, did they know about the war crimes? Were they trying to cover it up? Do we obey the law? Do we put out smoke screens? Do we put out false statements? None of that. None of that is anything to do with national security, and it's national. It's crimes.
Yep.
It's national embarrassment.
Which is what the national security smokescreen is good for covering up, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
National embarrassment.
National embarrassment.
You expected the raid on your place, but your leak also led to the raid, the AFP raid on the ABC. Did that shock you when that happened?
It was a real turning point in the case, and when I eventually write my book, it's one of the watershed moments. There wasn't much interest in me before that.
Right.
There was just the theft of the pieces of paper, and I remember exactly where I was. I was driving back down to Canberra for a court appearance or something, and Christopher Nouse from the newspaper reporter called me and said, "You understand, the ABC's been raided, and Annika Smethurst's underwear drawer has been raided, and after that the phone never stopped ringing. It was interesting. Everything changed, and it was kind of funny because I don't. It's a mystery, and you'd have to find some really, maybe some intrepid reporter with their finger on the pulse to really put that one together. I believe it was an overreach by Dutton and Morrison. Again, they've done polling. Because I think when they first asked Morrison about it, he was like, "Oh, I've got no apologies for the AFP, enforcing the law."
Yeah.
But they'd already raided my house. They already had all the documents, and the stuff was already online, so it wasn't clear what they were actually looking for, if anything. And it may have just been a show of force to sort of say, and in some ways it worked, because I've heard anecdotally that a lot of people who were going to do public interest stories or whistleblowers got scared after that, and a lot of stories got dropped and people ran for cover, and so maybe it worked in some, but it did. I was so proud that a couple of months later, I've never seen this before or since, but both the Australian and the Sydney Morning Herald ran the same cover, both covers with all blacked out saying, your right to know. And the ABC went behind. That was beautiful. I was very proud to be Australian on that day. They got behind it.
There was a big reaction.
Yeah, to say this is bullshit. I mean, we need to be able. The people need to know what is going on in our name, and there are limits to what they can do.
And that said, like that was a good symbolic sign, but nevertheless, it has had a chilling effect. You just mentioned that one. I'll give this other one I wanted to mention because at the end of that year, 2019, I was involved in a Senate hearing, and Senator Rex Patrick, on an unrelated matter, it was about a hearing into the government's bill to ban cash. He was talking about the Orwellian aspects of that, and he made mention of the Annika Smethurst ABC raids, and he pointed out that after those raids, every journalist contact on his phone switched to Signal, which is the encrypted app.
Yeah.
And he said everyone, like all the journalists in Canberra, suddenly felt they had to hide their activities from being able to be spied on by the government. And that's how they operate now. But what's interesting to me is, this is a police state we're in, yet you actually, despite that reaction to you, which was good, etc., the media don't generally report it that way. It's almost been accepted now.
No, that's why I was so happy about it, but that's right. This is the hopefully my case will change this. This is a game where I feel like I'm fighting for everybody. But the reality is, if you're a whistleblower, even if it was the most worthy thing, like you knew that there was nuclear waste, being dumped in Warragamba Dam, you wouldn't necessarily get a good run from the journalists. No. You would not necessarily. It's a lottery. They might paint you as a complete lunatic. You don't know whether you can't. I grew up relatively idealistic, there's no guarantee the media will back you.
Yeah.
They might, but they might not, and that's interesting. And whistleblowers almost need their own sort of PR company, and maybe that's what the protection agency will.
Well, you're in a pantheon now, David, of whistleblowers in Australia. I asked this question of Greg Barnes last night. Was it my perception, or is it truly much worse now? In the last 2 decades, you've got you, Witness K, Witness J, Bernard Collaery, Richard Boyle, the ATO whistleblower. Of course, Julian Assange is the big one. These are people that all your lives have been completely upended for doing the right thing and exposing the right thing. Yet you're not cause celebres on the front page every day. You're reported when something comes up, but we're supposed to accept that this is normal. When the subject comes up, what did they blow the whistle on? Oh yeah, that was bad. It is good we know that. What's going to happen to them? 50 years, 150 years for Richard Boyle. Don't know who Witness K was. Right? I mean, this is... why isn't the media crusading on this every day?
It's quite... it's very topsy-turvy world, that's right. In the meantime, we're giving out orders of Australia to oil company executives for fantastic profits that they've made and donations to the political party. It is... you can't let it get you down, though. You've got to say, we are going to win eventually. That's one of the things I've been extremely lucky about, in that I've got Bernard and Kay, and because you can easily be painted, and even without doing, you are an outlier as a whistleblower, and the government loves to be able to just say, oh, they were a crazy person, or even if you get up on your particular thing, they just say, oh, that was a one-off. They'll find a scapegoat. They'll throw, This is what Hurley's going to get a bad lesson in politics eventually. If it gets too hot for the government, they will throw him under the bus. And just say, oh, whew, we didn't know. What a terrible person. And that's the way they work. And that's if you get too far. But the fact that there's 5 of us really helps, because they can't just write it off as one bad apple, one crazy person. Beginning to see this is
systemic.
I wasn't complaining about war crimes particularly, but to complain that the Defence Force is a basket case. And it's not just the Defence Force. All government departments would have exactly the same problems, in that they window dress. They work to make the minister look good. They don't work to actually do their job, protect the country or whatever. And the ATO is the same. ACES, I was quite surprised by that. It's funny, and I saw all these people before. I've met them all now. But before, like the rest of Australia, I met them on TV, met in inverted commas, or read about them. But I instantly knew that I would have something in common with them, in that you could tell that there was more to their story than on. And it was the same thing. When I heard about Jeff Morris, the banking whistleblower, I never thought they'd get a Royal Commissioner, but I was just like, he is saying exactly what I said. And he wasn't talking about the financial planners at the bottom. He was saying the people, criminal activity was encouraged by the chairman of the board. And that was, I thought, wow, this guy's speaking my language. And Boyle, I could see, was the same. And that's why we need to band together. As we discussed before, wars are won by alliances, because we're all basically saying the same thing. We know, as a nation, we have lost our way in relation to ethics and the law, and it's the people at the top of our organisations and institutions so often that are the bad examples, not so much people down the bottom.
Well, before we wrap up, let's move on to geopolitics now, because I wanted to move the conversation to here. I follow you avidly on Twitter. You're very active in using the platforms you have to question these dominant narratives, especially the ones against China and Russia. So I've asked you this question from the other direction. I want to ask you this way now. How much was it your own experience that led you to actually question the big picture?
Yeah, I knew from Afghanistan, I knew that what the picture that we painted of these sort of brainwashed Islamic terrorists was wrong. And also I could see, as a professional soldier, I could see we were, by believing our own propaganda, we were ending up fighting a phantom that didn't even exist. You know? We were saying, oh, the only people that well, the Americans had a funny hard lesson, which they learned after suicide bombing went through the roof after about 2006, 2010. And they were like, why has this happened, you know? There must be some sort of like brainwashing centre in Pakistan. And they got someone from MIT to come over and professor, non-military. It's almost like they make it up. It's like the man who stare at goats or whatever. And he looked into it. And of course they didn't want to know his findings because it was an unpalatable truth they didn't want to know. They said, since you've invaded Iraq, you know, people from around the Muslim world are queuing up to become suicide bombers because they can see you are just so full of bullshit. You are so, you know, you are so arrogant in the way that you treat the world as just a plaything to do whatever you want. And it's not because people are brainwashed, but they just have to look at the news and see the truth of about America, and they want to do something about it.
Yeah.
But that was just too. It was just too an awful conclusion. I think the report got shelved. I think actually the guy who wrote the report might have become a whistleblower because it was an inconvenient truth, and they didn't want to know about it. And they wanted something again to do. You know, everything is about their propaganda, and they wanted something to confirm that these were these evil, brainwashed people that hate us for our freedoms, when actually they were normal people who hated them for their lies.
So that was your experience was the war on terror. The last few years, the big issue for Australia has been China, the China threat. How do you see that? Yeah, look, it's a hard one because there's been so much propaganda for so long. You've got to be careful about talking about it because people just don't want to believe it. But it is. I'm with you on that. We have been talked into hating China. We've been talked into hysteria about that China's somehow going to behind everything. It's going to invade us, and in the same way that we did with the Soviet Union in the 50s. And knowing what I know about the way we were, it really, as I said, I'm very focused on domestic politics. It goes back, unfortunately, you would think people are not so cynical that they would do anything just to win an election, but my experience is that that's not the case, that they would, they'd legalise pedophilia if they thought it was going to, fucking win them the election. There is no such thing. There would be a Liberal Party caucus room meeting on that, sure.
There is no issue which is off the table if the polling if the polling says
if that's the path to power.
There's no issue off the and the enemies. This is behind this argument. Enemies win elections. We want you want enemies. America can only survive with enemies. There has to be someone who hates us for our freedoms. That's how you sell arms. That's how you sell tanks. That's how you win elections. Anyone who's gone to war, John Howard or George W. Bush and even Obama, who dropped more bombs than anybody, they get re-elected by appearing presidential. I mean, ironically enough, Trump. This is one of the great ironies. Trump, who everybody hates, because he didn't start any new wars. In many ways, was one of the better presidents, but because he didn't start a war, even though he did lots of other stupid things. But and that's a big deal. I mean, that's something which you can be proud of, because everyone else, Hillary Clinton probably would have blown up the whole world in order to make herself more popular. They are very, the sort of people that seem to get, I used to think, well, if someone's rich or someone's prime minister, they must have something going for them. The older I get, I tend to believe, and apparently this is borne out by academic research, the CEOs are often pathological people and you know, psychopaths, and that's how they get ahead. And they're very good liars, and they just, you know, run people down and divide and rule. And I think a lot of politicians are the same. But yeah, they will send us to war in order to win an election. And China serves much more of an important political purpose by being an enemy that we have to fight. That will win. If we said, and it didn't make any, it was so ridiculous that a couple of years ago, only about 4, they were our biggest trading partner. Chinese naval ships were in Sydney Harbour, 200 metres off Garden Island, waving, you know. Like, what was that about? How come they were there if they were the enemy? And now, because of, you know, I think because of the Americans, because they told us to, because the Americans and the Chinese are, you know, economic rivals, that we have been talked into this. Oh my God, they're really evil. You know, they're killing people. They have all these concentration camps. Now, we don't know if any of that is true, and it doesn't mean it isn't true. But you've got to be very wary. The further away a place is, the more likely it is to be made up. You know, and I would be, your viewers obviously know all this stuff, but we want to go to war with China, or the Americans do. I mean, so it's rather than, it's a bit like, I used to love magic tricks when I was a kid, and I still like them, but the way most of magic, or a lot of magic tricks are, the way they get away with it is everything is reverse engineered. You pretend you're pulling something, but it's already there. And the thing about the whole China thing is that the narrative is we have to go to war against them because they're killing Uyghurs, and also they're going to take over Taiwan. But actually, it's the other way around. We want to go to war against China, so therefore we are going to make up stuff which can justify it. We are a bit like Ukraine. We want to go to war against Russia. We want to destabilise them, a bit like Afghanistan. Therefore, we will pressure them in relation to Ukraine. We will, you know, do all those things that we know where we can make this pressure point where they will do something. They'll be forced into a corner and they're going to do something. And then we can go, oh my God, we have to go to war against Russia. But we have created the situation because war is good for America. And so I believe that's with China. It's not, we are, actually, the Americans is surrounding China. It's not China. And every time I see it in the newspapers, China's expansionism. It's actually, but they've done such a good job. And as I said, it's hard. Like, I meet perfectly rational, nice people, friends of mine, and they'd say things like, I went to Samoa last week or whatever. And I go, that was good. And they'd say, it's terrible. The Chinese built a wharf. There's this big wharf. And I'm like, well, just a wharf, is that a bad thing? Well, it could become a naval, eventually. And I'm like, well, the Americans have actual naval bases in Australia. And yet, why is the people don't see it? That's kind of a bit nuts. But and this is one thing. As I said, I like to I like to laugh at the pink and white security paper thing. But the one thing that the Americans have done very well is successful demonising of China and Putin over the last 20 years. As I said, the state of the world is now is that they could unilaterally carpet bomb Russia with nuclear bombs and there wouldn't be any outcry. People would say, oh, well done, you've saved us from Hitler. And that's the state of play. And China's the same. They could pretty much go to war unilaterally against China now because people are convinced that they are this kind of baby-eating race, and they're out to get us. And no one. And it's particularly sad for me, I think, because it's like the farmers, a lot of people have suffered from this, a lot of Australians have, and it just shows you how ridiculous our policy is, where in order to make, an idiot like Pompeo or Biden happy, we have really screwed over Australian farmers, Australian winemakers, for what? To make the Americans happy. I mean, it's... what about putting Australia's interests first? You know, that's what I want to see.
But when you've demonised them so well in the population to the point when last year or the year before the ABC Four Corners showed the industry suffering from the trade sanctions, and this lobster grower in Tassie who used to send plane loads of lobsters to China, and he was reduced to taking a styrofoam box to his local school fete to sell them there. And he's talking in the interview and saying this is terrible, but at least we're standing up for our values. Anyway, we could talk about that all day. We won't. We really are running out of time. Let's finish on this, because I was struck by you talk. You raised this a few times last night, so this might surprise people. How do you feel about the future in terms of your case and this broader picture?
Yeah, I've always come at from a soldier's point of view, and this is one of the clashes that I have with activists, and we've, and you would probably have the same as well. I'm not from an activist background, and I see it as it's kind of World War II. It's a battle, and I believe we're going to win. And I can't stomach activists who kind of, or even friends who have lunch and say, "Oh, it's really bad. This is, it was bad." But then we have to you can't just complain about something. Yeah. You've got to win, and I reckon we're going to win. I think what's going to happen, I'm going to win my case. Boyle might win his case first, and because I'm relatively establishment, relatively someone, and talking about pretty major things like, is our Chief of Defence Force a liar who just did soldiers take people out the back and blow their heads off and get medals for it? I mean, that's pretty normal stuff. It's hard to paint me as some sort of like crazy hippie who wants to bring the end of civilization down. Yeah. And if I can win my case, and then get a bit of momentum behind me, I can start being a spokesman for Julian Assange and saying, he's not what you think he is. And yes, I understand he had a funny haircut, and he's actually, turns out he's got some unusual personality traits, but he's not. He is a good person, and he was revealing war crimes, and or WikiLeaks was. Things that were really bad by the Americans. No action has been taken against the people who lied about thousands of deaths, all that double dealing. Yeah. And we need to do something about those major things before we put him in jail. Anyway, to advocate on his behalf, and I think he will eventually get out. I do believe it's kind of the dawning of a new era. It's going to be quite tight, but I reckon we can, with people like yourself, we are actually going to win. It might take a couple more years, but it'll be step by step that we will get up and people will say, hang on, our governments, we just make shit up, and we need to stop just making shit up. And when we're going to get there, in the same way that we won the Second World War by landing in Normandy and going in the next level, landing in Italy, going up to the next town and bombing, and bit by bit, not going to happen overnight, but we make one victory run into the next.
Well, David, thank you very much for joining us today on Citizens Insight. It's been a long conversation, but a very enlightening one. Given you're going to be in a trial within a few weeks, I encourage the viewers to refer back to this discussion, because I think it'll be the best insight they'll have into it. So thanks for being so open with us. And I'll also say to the viewers, this is a big deal. As you can see from what David said, he's fighting this on behalf of all of us. It would change the system. So we're going to put a link below to your GoFundMe page for his legal fighting fund, which he's going to need all the help he can get. So please support David in that regard. And yeah, let's win this battle. Get behind David, and let's keep winning them. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.